Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I am here to help you sleep better with true horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like my video. I would love to know where you are from and what time you're watching this video. So please leave a comment to let me know, and I will draw from that experience to tell even better stories. When you are ready, feel free to relax. Hello, I'm Lucy. When I was 12 years old and in 6th grade, I had 3 best friends that I loved to hang out with constantly. We also loved to have sleepovers, but we always took turns having houses, which was very convenient because we lived in the same neighborhood and our moms knew each other from school. This time, we had decided to have a sleepover at my friend Catherine's house. Catherine was the youngest of 4 siblings. She had 2 older sisters, and on this particular occasion, a couple of their cousins were also staying at their house. Kat had a great relationship with her siblings. Her brother would occasionally let us play PS4, while her sisters were constantly talking about boys and high school gossip. Her cousin, who was in the 8th grade, was very kind and nice, and whenever we went to sleepovers at their house, they usually stayed in their rooms and only went out to eat, so we never felt like we were bothering them in any way. Approximately the same age as one of the older catering sisters. This one was staying in her room. The cousin, a boy in his junior year of high school, was staying with Kat's brother in his room, as was to be expected. Her cousin was very nice, despite the fact that she appeared a little shy. The boy, on the other hand, was a little creepy. He was definitely much more outgoing than his sister. But there was something unsettling about his mannerisms, particularly when he smiled, as he did it in a way that made it seem as though he was smiling too. In the brief time I spent with him, I could tell that Kat felt uneasy around him. He had dirty, black, greasy, stringy shoulder-length hair, and he was quite thin. Later, when we were all in Kat's room, Kat informed us that she had recently met her cousins because her mother and aunt had not spoken to each other for years due to their ongoing arguments. But they had recently reconciled and reconnected, so they both agreed it would be beneficial if the aunt and her kids visited. She told me that she thought her cousin was very nice, but that she thought he was strange from the first moment she saw him. My friend told me that he had tried to hang out with her instead of her brother, and that he did strange things like going to her room and looking through her books and toys to try to talk to her. He would also do things that were uncomfortable for her, like stroking her hair and cheeks in a way that was kind of. We all agreed that he was a really strange boy, but at that age we lacked the maturity or malice to suspect that behind these gestures there could be malicious intentions. So we didn't make a big deal out of it and continued talking about other topics, the usual things that 6th graders talk about. She usually walked away from him because something made her feel strange, and whenever she did, he had this really cold look in his eyes before smiling, that creepy smile. When Yucker, another friend, returned and informed me that she was finished, I was relieved because I was extremely nervous and exhausted, and all I wanted to do was brush my teeth before going to bed. Ultimately, we watched a movie and took turns using the bathroom down the hall that Catherine shared with one of her sisters, the older one being the oldest. Since the middle sister had her own bathroom in the room, we all asked for our turn to brush our teeth, and since I didn't really care, I was the last to go there. I was so preoccupied that I didn't notice Kat's cousin in the bathroom until I turned on the light and saw him sitting there on the toilet. I quickly excused myself and closed the door at that point because it gave me a really weird feeling that he was locked in the bathroom with the light off, doing nothing, because while I was sitting on the toilet, he was with my friends until he fell asleep. I went down the hall again and opened the bathroom door. If that wasn't strange, I don't know what would be, but before I could leave, he opened the door, grinned, and said, "Go ahead." I didn't mind brushing my teeth at the time, but I didn't want to rush off and treat him badly. So I thanked him and went into the bathroom, shutting the door behind me right away. I hurriedly brushed my teeth and took care of my business, and that's when things started to get really unsettling for me. I opened the door, and to my surprise, he was still smiling and waiting. Feeling extremely uneasy, I blocked the door and asked him if I could leave. He said, "Should I walk you to your room?" I wasn't sure how to respond, so I assumed he took my silence as a yes. Before I knew it, he grabbed my right hand and led me back to Kat's room. His hands were warm and sweaty, even though he didn't appear to be perspiring, and it wasn't even hot. As I walked hand in hand with her towards my friend's room, I felt my body go numb and could hear my own breathing. I honestly felt like I was going to pass out. I swear that hallway had never felt so long when I finally got their cat's room. That as he let go, my hand and said, "Good night," walking back to the room. He was staying the one we passed through before we got to Catherine's room. When I walked in, I guess the look on my face was such that all my friends came up to me and asked me what had happened to me. And after a few seconds of being a little shocked, I told them what happened, and they all agreed that it was super weird. Kat said she would ta LK to her mom in the morning, and I hoped it would end there. But unfortunately, this was just the beginning of a scary night. Our parents had set us a very clear rule for sleepovers, and that is that you're not allowed to lock the doors during sleepovers. That was usually okay, but not in this case. I had to have been asleep for a few hours when suddenly I woke up to Kat shaking me frantically apart. Instantly, she had been awake for quite a while, and since I was sleeping next to her, I was the first one she ran to and told her what was going on. My friend, in a shaky, cracked voice, told me that her cousin had already opened the bedroom door twice, and on both occasions he just stared at us with his characteristic sinister smile for a couple of minutes, and then closed the door slowly and quietly. She was awake, but she pretended to be asleep to watch what I was doing. I really freaked out when I heard this. He was just watching asleep, and that was creepy. I was sleeping on the floor at the time, but I had to crawl in a bed with her. We waited to see if her stranger and cousin would return, but we didn't have to wait long because we heard the door open, and we both froze in bed and stared at it. The hallway lamp was out, and the only light in the room was the moon's reflection through the window. But even so, we could see the silhouette of someone's head peeking through the door, and we could feel his eyes on us. As Kat mentioned, he was simply staring at us in the dark, and he remained there for a few seconds. We tried not to move so he wouldn't know we were awake. But at one point, he appeared to be trying not to laugh by letting out a little air through his nose. He then whispered something, and then he simply closed the door. Catherine and I were both terrified. I turned to face my friend, who looked like she was going to cry. We hugged and waited for her to return, but she didn't. I assumed she chose not to return because she realized we weren't asleep, and who knows what her intention would be that night. After waiting for a few hours, I fell asleep, and the next morning my mom came to pick me up quite early, and I was glad that Catherine's creepy cows was still asleep by that time. 2 days later on Monday, I saw CAD at school. I asked her what happened when I left, and she told me her mom was very worried, and I assured her that I would talk to her. I guess she also told my mom what happened to me, because she asked me about it later and was curious to know what I would tell her. I finally told her what happened, and from then on she made sure Therene's cousins weren't around before allowing me to sleep over at her house again, but she didn't have to worry because they never came to visit again after that. My name is Arthur, and I'm currently 20 years old, but when I was 13 years old and in my first year of high school, I had a classmate named Edgar who invited me one weekend for a sleepover at his house. This was a little unexpected because I didn't know Edgar very well. We had talked a couple times before, but we weren't close friends since we were just starting the school year, and we were practically all new, so we hadn't really spent much time together. I told him I wasn't sure, but he talked me into it, so I agreed and asked my mom when I got home, and she gave me permission, so he took me to his house after school. When I arrived at his house, the first thing I noticed was that it was very big and nice. It had a beautiful garden, and you could see a small forest in the back. I was still quite surprised that he invited me over, but I thought it would be nice to meet a new friend, and he seemed like a nice guy. Edgar took me around his house, which was really interesting. He had a large living room with a large TV and a ton of cool video games, which instantly caught my attention because I love playing video games. When I told him this, he invited me over for a game, and we played Super Smash Bros. And Mario Kart. As I got to know Edgar, I also noticed some oddities. 06. He had a peculiar way of talking and moving, and his room was full of all kinds of unusual things like comic books and action figures from different eras. He also had a weird demeanor. Sometimes he seemed lost in his own world. He laughed to himself sometimes, and I even think at one point I caught him talking to himself. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt I didn't get along with him. Then at As time for bed, I crawled into my sleeping bag on the floor of his room, which seemed to be a fairly large room for a child. It took me a long time to fall asleep, but I eventually managed it, however AF. Hours later, I woke up feeling very hot and almost suffocated. I was sweating, and that's when I noticed that my sleeping bag was completely closed and there were two thick blankets covering me up too. My head, I immediately pulled everything off me and instantly started to feel much cooler. I looked around and knew I definitely didn't put that extra blanket on myself. I thought maybe Edgar did S. Oh, I turned to where he was thinking he was asleep, but I realized he was wide awake, so I asked him why he had placed the blanket on my head, but he denied it. I knew he was lying because it was clear that it was just the two of us in the room, but when I accused him again, he became enraged, his face turning red, and he began to yell at me. I have to admit that I was a little afraid because of his aggressive reaction, so I chose to put the incident out of my mind, go back to bed, and spend the rest of the night there. It took me some time to fall asleep again, but when I woke up, it was already morning and I looked around the room. Edgar wasn't there when I expected to see him, so I assumed he had gone to the bathroom or something. I waited for a few minutes, but then I really wanted to go to the bathroom, so I tried to leave the room, but when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't open. It appeared to be locked from the outside. That was it. I was furious with Edgar for how he was treating me, so I called my mother and asked her to come get me. I didn't enjoy being in that house at all, and he was acting rude. Complete jerk. I was relieved when my mother said she would come get me, but I was still locked in and needed to urinate. So I knocked on the door multiple times and even called his name once, but I got no response. The EDG guard's house was large, so I assumed I wasn't in any immediate danger. But the entire situation made me extremely angry and frustrated. I swear, for a brief moment, I considered peeing on his bed in retaliation, but I am decent, so I didn't do it despite feeling trapped and upset. Edgar's mother finally opened the door to her room after what seemed like an eternity, looked a little surprised to see me, and said in a slightly irritated tone that my mom was here to pick me up. I left the room right away, without even saying goodbye to Edgar's mother. I know that was a little rude of me, but I was so furious at the time that I just got in my mother's car and drove home. I was so happy to get home and put that whole terrible experience behind me, but I was mistaken. When my mom called to tell me that one of my friends was in the driveway, I went outside to find Edgar standing at the front door. His expression was tense, as if he was too upset, and his eyes looked like they would burst into flames at any moment. I approached him, and he nearly snarled at me, asking why I had left his house so early and without even saying goodbye to him. It was Sunday, so I spent the rest of the day lounging around the house and playing video games. This infuriated me, so I told him that if he didn't remember, he had attempted to suffocate me with blankets, locked me in his room, and vanished. The cynical man denied everything and called me a rude and bad friend. I shrugged and slammed the door in his face, then went back inside and resumed playing video games, but 15 minutes later, I heard a loud noise coming from my window and a terrible thump on the right side of my head. The pain was so intense that I screamed and threw myself on. Glass was all over the floor, and there was a fist-sized rock next to my chair. My parents came running into my room when they heard the window open and my cries, and as my mother hurried to help me desperately, my father glanced out the window and saw Edgar running down the street. My parents took me to the hospital right away and called Edgar's parents. Fortunately, he didn't have a fractured skull, but he did have a large open wound that needed 10 stitches and multiple painkillers and antibiotics, but most of all, it hurt a lot. When my mother called Edgar's mother, I could hear them fighting for a while before hanging up. I don't know what happened to Edgar after that, but I never saw him again at music school. Did you ever feel like you were stuck in a never-ending nightmare? It all began as a harmless sleepover with games, laughter, and jokes between friends, but everything changed suddenly. And a night that was supposed to be pure fun swiftly turned into a real horror story, and it was all due to a harmless practical joke. I've always enjoyed sleepovers. The excitement of spending the night away from home with my closest friends, laughing and sharing secrets, is so fulfilling. My name is Andrea, and I was 15 years old when I met up with 5 friends, all of whom were classmates at one of their homes. We arrived at around 7 o'clock p.m. Tanya, the landlady, was the one who always made me feel uncomfortable. She had a bad habit of making nasty jokes about my appearance and saying things that made me feel bad or look ridiculous in front of the others. Don't get me wrong, among friends, we always used to carry our backpacks full of pajamas, candy, and board games. My friend's house was huge, and her parents wouldn't arrive until the next day. So everything was perfect. It would be just the five of us having fun and having a good time all night without any parental restrictions. We started the night with the usual girl honor, sleepover activities once we were all there. We talked about the guys at school, got our hair done, and practiced the newest makeup trends. However, in Tanya's case, things felt a little more intense. I felt like she wanted to annoy me seriously in a way, and I never knew how to respond to her cad remarks. Instead, I usually ended up laughing nervously and changing the subject very quickly to avoid making a bad scene. One of my favorite things to do at girl sleepovers is to buy a bunch of junk food and watch a movie. However, before somebody suggested that we play chase in the house, which we all thought was a great idea, I had no idea that it would lead to one of the scariest nights of my life. One of those genuine and terrifying horror stories you never forget. For a long time, we ran around the house, screaming and laughing while hiding in closets and behind furniture. At first, it was hilarious 6. As the girls ran around the house, chasing each other and laughing uncontrollably, I realized that Tanya was only interested in pursuing me. Her advances became increasingly aggressive until she finally caught up to me and threw me to the ground with excessive force, which was unnecessary and excessive. She hit me quite hard, and for a brief moment, I stood there gasping for air, feeling the weight of her body on mine. Then she whispered in my ear, "That's what's wrong with you, fatso. You don't run fast." This made me feel uneasy because, even though she said it in a playful way, almost like a joke, my friends could sense the bad intent behind it. They also noticed that the carefree laughter had changed to a tense silence, and I tried to get up, but he held me down. So I said enough is enough while trying to maintain my composure in spite of my mounting anxiety. At that point, the others decided to intervene and quickly and efficiently teach her a lesson. Although it was challenging because she was very strong and struggling frantically, they all managed to pull her off of me and immobilize her. It took us nearly 20 minutes to restrain her, and by then, we were all nearly out of breath. At that moment, we all stepped back as we watched her bound hand and foot on the living room floor. The atmosphere was strange because my friends were just as upset as I was about her treatment of me, but at least we managed to tie a rope, or rather, makeshift ropes, around her hands and legs. At the same time, we knew that everything had gone too far, but as she was yelling for us to free her, one of my friends warned her that she would remain there for a long time because she was being aggressive and a bad friend. I wasn't sure if I agreed with her at first, but I thought it was a little unsettling to see Tanya bound up there. Eventually, the girls agreed that it was a form of punishment for her mistreatment of me, and after the incident, we turned on the TV and began watching a reality show. When the girls made it clear to Tanya that they would not untie her until she retracted and apologized to me, she became irate and stopped talking to us. However, at one point, when we were totally absorbed in the TV show, we heard Tanya's voice coming from the kitchen, and when we turned around, we saw that she was not where we had left her. She was now untied and standing in the kitchen doorway with an almost devilishly angry expression on her face. Our eyes widened as she held a huge knife in her right hand, and we all heard her say, "Now you're going to regret it," with a great deal of fury. At the same time, she ran out, the knife held high in our direction. Panic struck without warning, and we all fled in different directions. 3 of the girls managed to enter one of the rooms, locking the door behind them, while I desperately ran to the upstairs bathroom. My heart was racing, so I locked the door and huddled against it when I heard Tanya's powerful footsteps coming up the stairs, screaming for us to get out and try to tie her up again. I was certain she could hear it, and then I heard Tanya banging loudly on the door of the room where my friend were locked. It sounded like she was kicking it and hitting it with the knife hilt, as you could hear the sound of the metal hitting the wood, while the girls were yelling on the other side. Tanya began screaming my name and threatening me while she was hammering on the door of the room where my friends were, which led me to believe that she probably thought I was there too. However, it didn't take her long to realize that I wasn't in the room, even though I didn't hear the girls say anything to her. We were pleading with Tanya to stop acting like a psychopath, but she wouldn't stop insulting them and repeatedly saying that she would kill them all. It's possible that she realized I wasn't there because she didn't hear my voice. Then, when I heard her footsteps again down the hallway, she was yelling at me to stop being a coward and to leave my current location. She appeared to be going through each room, but it didn't take her long to figure out where I was, so she went to the bathroom door where I was sitting on the floor in a complete panic. "Hey, Amy," she said in a deceptively sweet voice. "Why are you hiding?" At one point, I tried to talk some sense into her by asking her to calm down and telling her that she was acting crazy and that she had overblown the situation. I also told her that if anyone got hurt, she would be in serious trouble, so she should put the knife away instead and stop the nonsense for a minute. I thought she would realize how ridiculous she was being and that her behavior was truly out of control. But instead she started banging on the door uncontrollably. Door once more, but this time with much more vigor and anger. It seems as though what I told her had made her even more irrational. Tanya was hitting the door so hard that I was certain she would eventually smash it down. At the same time, she was insulting me, saying all sorts of nasty things, and repeating that she would kill me. She was completely insane, and she started saying that she would stab me until it was blunt and that she wouldn't care if she was in prison for as long as she could. She also repeatedly said, "I'll finish you, you fat." I must admit that I had never experienced such panic in my life. I was utterly terrified because, based on her behavior, it was obvious that she was mentally ill. I'm not sure how long I sat huddled against the wall, trembling with fear and listening to Tanya's threats. But it was undeniable that she had some sort of mental illness that neither my friends nor I were aware of. My mind raced, trying to figure out how a simple sleepover had turned into one of those horror stories we usually only hear about in the scary stories we usually see on the internet. It was the most intense experience of terror I have ever had in my life, and the hours passed slowly as I stayed inside that tiny bathroom. At one point, I must have fallen asleep, and when I woke up, I could see through the small bathroom window how, as the darkness of the night gradually gave way to the light of dawn, there was silence. For a brief moment, I believed that everything that had happened that night had been a nightmare, and I might have believed it if I had been sleeping in my sleeping bag or curled up in bed with one of my friends. But I was still in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, which is proof that it had all been real. At some point in the early morning hours, I heard muffled voices from. The other girls were whispering to each other downstairs, probably just as scared as I was. I wanted to scream for help, but I was afraid of drawing attention, so I stayed silent. Finally, I lay there, exhausted and terrified. I must have been so tired that I fell asleep again, but this time my sleep was restless, and I had nightmares about Tanya attacking me in the bathroom and killing me with a knife. I woke up startled and my heart pounding, only to realize that I was still locked up, but safe. Coming to a stop with adult voices at that precise moment, a wave of relief swept over me from head to toe. When my friend's parents finally showed up to pick up their daughters, they had no idea how horrible the entire night had been. To make matters worse, by the time the incident occurred, our cell phones were in a drawer in the living room because we had decided to leave them turned off so we wouldn't be disturbed while watching our favorite reality show. So we couldn't call them or ask for assistance in any way, as I was still terrified and my legs were extremely numb. I went downstairs to the bathroom and discovered a completely bizarre scene. Tanya was sitting quietly on the couch, talking to her mother, as though nothing had happened, while the other girls were all pale and silent, exchanging anxious looks with one another. As ridiculous as it may seem, nobody discussed the incident with Tanya's parents. Instead, we simply gathered our belongings in silence and left each of us to bear the burden of that. The truth is that we never told our parents or anyone else what happened on that awful night when the sleepover had turned into a true horror story. We did this because we thought that if we told them, they would never allow us to have another sleepover, even though we loved doing it. However, we never did it with Tanya again after that day, and she never wanted to talk to us either, so we chose to ignore it. This happened to me in 2005 when I was in 5th grade and living in western Montana. I was sharing a room with my sister, who was in 2nd grade at the time, but instead of having 2 single beds, we had a king-size bed that we shared. To better understand the story, I'll tell more. I learned a valuable lesson that day, which is that the people we think we know may turn out to be completely different from what we think they are. Basically, if you stood in front of the window, your eyes would be at the level of the backyard floor up, and to the left above my window, you could see our terrace, which overlooked our kitchen. I know it sounds confusing, but you get the idea. That night, a cousin had stayed over with us for a sleepover, and we played video games, ate chips, and watched a movie. It was a cliché, but our cousin was in bed with us, as we were, drifting off to sleep at 1 a.m. My sister and I got out of bed as soon as he woke us up to show us that there was a deer on our deck. We went to the window and looked, and sure enough, there was a deer on the deck. This was common in Montana, so after admiring the lovely little animal for a while, we lay back down on the bed and fell asleep again, or rather my sister and I did, since apparently my cousin stayed up looking at it for a while longer. About 20 minutes later, he woke us up and said he believed there was now a person. When we saw what appeared to be 2 green laser lights, 2 tiny pinpoint lights coming from the guy's head area, we all thought they were binoculars. By this point, we were on high alert, and our eyes had adjusted a little to the new situation. I looked at each other in confusion, but we got back up and looked outside to see what it was. We saw a shadow moving across our terrace, and it was obviously that of a person, like the silhouette of a tall, thin man. We were too afraid to go upstairs and tell my parents about the guy snooping around, so we used my cousin's cell phone to call the home phone. Since we had a cell phone at the time, it rang loudly, and then we saw the guy running full speed off the deck. As soon as he got away, the 3 of us ran screaming up the stairs and told my dad everything we saw. He called the police, and when they arrived, they searched every street but were unable to find the man. I remember this because my mom, who was a little paranoid about the whole thing, once took us to the home address listed on the notice and made us very aware that this was happening and we weren't allowed to ride. This is where things get creepy because just 2 weeks prior, the city police station sent out several notices in our neighborhood informing us that a dangerous predator with an arrest warrant had been spotted in our area. The guy was presumably staying with a family member 3 blocks from us. The most unsettling and terrifying thing is that during some of his interrogations, he admitted to stalking the children by using night vision goggles to watch their homes at night, the same green lights we saw that night, and I remember looking in the house every time we passed by. It turns out that about 2 or 3 months after the incident, this same man was arrested for the kidnapping, abuse, and eventual murder of 2 children and their family in Idaho, just 2 hours from our neighborhood. He mentioned living in Montana at different points in time on an obscure website that contained some of his rights. He also mentioned that, just before killing this family, he was looking for kids to kidnap, and we were the same age as the kids he kidnapped. Story 5. Frank's haunted house. I've known Frank since kindergarten, and we've always been best friends. I'd say that over the years, we've had a lot of sleepovers at each other's house, sometimes because my parents were away, other times because Frank needed help with school, or we just wanted to hang out, but there have been so many reasons over the years that we didn't even need them anymore. Frank and his family got their house when his grandmother died a few years ago, and it's a 1-story house with lots of rooms and extra spaces. Like most houses, when you walk in the front door, there's a long hallway that's about 20 to 25 feet long, with doors leading to other rooms at the end of the hallway on the left side. This is a fairly large room that we call the studio. Frank has lived in that house for a long time, and he has told me about some strange things he has seen and felt there, like someone watching him, and he frequently hears strange noises. I remember one time we were all in Frank's mom's office, which was across the street, and she was explaining some things to us about an exam we had the next day. But at one point I really needed to use the restroom. The living room is connected to a dining room and kitchen, and on the right side of the hallway is a door leading to a guest room. but it is currently used for storage. I asked Frank's mother if I could use her bathroom, and she graciously gave me the keys to her house, which was across the street. I must admit that I was a little anxious as a child and was easily frightened by such things, so I wasn't especially happy when she told me that I had to go to her house by myself. The problem is that, as far as I can recall, I was using the restroom of my friend's house when the bathroom fan suddenly turned on by itself. You can imagine how I would have felt when I saw that. Attack! I hastily finished and left as soon as possible. A few years later, in 2014, I visited Frank's house more frequently in the hopes of witnessing more strange events because, at that point, I was fascinated by paranormal phenomena, mediums, programs, and other things. However, from that year until the end of 2015, I witnessed enough strange things to make me hesitant to return. So let's take it slow. It was July 2014, and since Frank and I were 13 years old, of course we like to do. I used to frequently stay at my friend's house during that time, and even though his mother always resisted us go to bed, we usually slept in the study because the recliners there were much more comfortable than any of the beds in the house. Our routine was essentially the same every day. Frank would fall asleep, and I would lie restlessly all night until I finally passed out from sleep. The couches were against the wall, so you could see I remember lying there once thinking about something I can't remember now. But I know I was trying to fall asleep like all the time. I was only a few feet away from Frank, and he was sound asleep, and then I started to feel a slight breeze and a shiver. The rest of the living room and dining room were completely dark, and it was easy to get scared, especially when you could see into the kitchen because it led to another room further down the hall that was filled with creepy old dolls that they kept from Frank's father's years as a stage actor. I pulled the covers over myself after feeling a blast of cold air, thinking it was just a draft. But then I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye and heard a faint whisper that sounded like it was right next door. I suppose I don't need to say that I didn't get much sleep that night, but things like that continued to happen until I eventually began to get used to it. However, there was one night when things really got out of control, and it was so terrifying that there was never again for months. Again, this occurred in early 2015. Frank and I were playing Halo 4 when we decided to go to the kitchen to get some refreshments. We closed the door when we left, but when we returned later, it was wide open. We didn't give it much thought and went inside to play on his Xbox 360 for a few more hours before deciding it was time for bed. We turned off the games and went straight to the bedroom. His bed was fairly large, so we slept on opposite sides for about 30 minutes. After a few minutes, Frank was already asleep, as usual, and I was about to do the same when I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up to see that his door was still wide open, as it had been before, because I didn't like being able to see down the hallway, which appeared to be a dark hole in the house. I got up to close the door, but 10 minutes later, I heard it open again, and by that point, I was so terrified that I spent the rest of the night hearing nothing but the creaking sound of the door. When I lived in the state of Florida, I had a best friend named Billy, whom I will refer to for the sake of this story because I do not want to reveal his true identity. Billy and I used to sleep over at each other's house almost every weekend and occasionally even during the week when we were together. I learned since then not to mess with the paranormal because by trying to satisfy your curiosity, you might just get nightmares for years to come. I hope you will muse it too. I had a few friends who lived closer to me, but not many because I didn't like to socialize too much. In addition, most of the other students in my high school were kind of weird, so Billy was the only person I had a close relationship with. That day, my friend asked if I wanted to spend the night at his house, and of course I said yes. At that point, I was already at his house because that afternoon he asked me to help him repair. Billy lived with her family and had 2 dogs and a kitten. One of her dogs was a huge, intimidating Rottweiler, and he always made me a little nervous. However, as I got to know him, I realized that he was gentle and giant at the same time, and he loved to cuddle with us. That night, we played video games for about 3 hours before going for a walk. As we passed his house, I noticed a really creepy guy who lived nearby. I had heard terrible things about him, but he never really. Billy and I were on our way to a local store to buy drinks and fried food, to watch a movie, when we noticed that it was closed. The other stores had already closed, and Walmart was too far away to walk, so we had no choice but to head back. We hurried home without any problems and began watching our movie, but in the middle of that, one of Billy's friends called him and asked him for help with something that I can't recall at the moment. But I do know that Billy left to assist his friend and told me that I could use his computer to play games or watch more movies till he returned. At that point, it was almost 2 in the morning. Since I was sitting on a couch that was next to a window and literally facing the front entrance of the house, I chose to watch a horror movie to kill time. About an hour later, Billy's Rottweiler started flipping out and barking loudly toward the door. Looking out the window, I saw a man sitting on a motorcycle outside, staring at me. At first, I thought he might have been one of Billy's neighbors who had visited her house for some reason. But when he didn't move at all, I became nervous and went to the kitchen to get a knife. When I got back to the front door, the man was still standing there. Normally, I wouldn't act aggressively toward people unless they posed a serious threat to me or my friends. We stared at each other for about 10 minutes without moving. Then I opened the door and stood halfway outside, prepared to run back if needed. After a half smile that I somehow found unsettling, he lifted up his jacket and I felt sick to my stomach. He was carrying a concealed weapon in the waistband of his pants. My face must have gone white as a sheet at this point, and 1,000 scenarios began to play in my mind. When Billy finally returned about 20 minutes later, I rushed to tell him everything that had happened. But he tried to reassure me by saying that it might have just been a random jerk who wanted to annoy me, telling me that if he had intended to attack me, he would have. I was terrified, but before I could run, he started his motorcycle's engine, smiled mockingly at me, and sped down the road. My heart was racing, and I couldn't leave that guy behind. We woke up, had breakfast, and played some video games the following day, as usual. Later, when the computer was free, I used the opportunity to log on to Facebook, something I hadn't done in a few days. I came across a post from one of my friends who also lived in that neighborhood, who said that she woke up in the middle of the night and looked out the window next to her bed when she noticed an odd man sitting on a motorcycle and looking. The incident happened to me and my 2F. Rien's when we were 14 and 15 years old. My parents were upstairs that day, and we were all in the basement, which was roomy, clean, and well lit, and it looked like any other room in my house. So we weren't afraid or anything. Instead, we were acting like typical teenagers when one of my friends arrived. I'm not sure if it was the same guy, but I was really shocked by that. Fortunately, that was my only experience with a gun-toting stranger. My other friends used to frequently invite me out, but they would never let me because it was too late. I was perfectly okay with the idea that we wouldn't do anything too crazy, just walk around and play some music, nothing that would draw too much attention, nothing that could put us in danger. And we waited until my parents were asleep. I came up with a brilliant idea to sneak out. We all got very quiet because we were all very young, so we all had early curfews and never went out after 10 o'clock at night. So I went back to the basement and told my friends that we should wait 10 more minutes just in case. And then we all quietly walked out the front door. Fortunately, my front door doesn't creak or make any noise. You just have to close it quietly so you don't hear the distinctive click of the lock. I was actually pretending to grab some food from the kitchen, but in reality, I was checking to see if I could see the light in their room on while they slept with the door open. I didn't hear them, so I was certain that this was the time. Our plan was to walk to a nearby 7-Eleven about 15 minutes away, but when my friend received an airdrop notification on his phone, it seemed odd that there wasn't any airdrop. There's a forest in front of my house, and we definitely weren't going to walk there, so we walked down the road parallel to the forest. However, because the road was completely deserted at this hour, we ended up walking in the middle of the road. We started singing some songs, not loud enough to wake anyone, but loud enough to be enjoyable. Ree and my other friend Jason began cursing at the person in the woods to get them to come out, telling them to show their face or send another airdrop to reveal their location. Ray checked the notification and saw a picture of us walking down the street. We looked in the direction of the photo and realized it had been taken somewhere in the woods, but it was too dark to see anything. The idea of someone watching us in the woods was too frightening. But nothing happened, so we sped up and turned off the music. We arrived at the 7-Eleven without any issues, but we were still fascinated by the strange photo. We left the 7-Eleven and watched our backs. We were considering taking a ride to our high school. But we were too alarmed by the picture, so the escape wasn't going as smoothly as we had hoped. After a little while of wandering around, we received another airdrop notification, and my heart began to race as soon as he. When I opened it, I saw another picture of us, but this time it was blurry, as if it had been taken quickly to avoid being discovered. We all turned to look behind us, but all we could see was a car parked on the side of the road, which was the only place this person could have hidden in that short amount of time. I told my friend about it, and they began insulting the invisible man once more, but this time they were calling him derogatory names. And then something really eerie suddenly happened, and a voice began to sing in a spooky manner from behind the car. They were psychopathically singing a song that said, "You better run. You better run before it's too late." They repeated the same line repeatedly in a really frightful voice. And when we heard it, we all hurried as quickly as we could back to my house. Luckily, we weren't followed, but what happened was so terrifying that we didn't tell our parents about it, because we didn't want to come clean. I hope your day is filled with health and joy. I invite you to subscribe to my channel to hear true horror stories. Hello, and see you again.